All right, today we want to look at Japan during the Middle Ages. Um, Japan also had a feudal system similar to Europe's, but I want to make sure we understand the differences and similarities. First, we'll talk about Japan's geography. Japan is an island chain to the east of China. It's an archipelago, or a chain of islands, made of more than 4,000 islands. The five most populated ones are right here on the map. Japan's geography has a fairly mild climate and lots of rainfall, so you'd think there's plenty of places to farm. But if you notice the topography, the differences in elevation, Japan has a lot of mountains, and most of the islands are actually covered in either mountains or forest. And that means there's actually relatively little farmland, although it is fairly productive. Japan's also resource poor, meaning there's not a lot of natural resources. Very little iron, not a lot of, as we said, farmland. And that means Japan is sometimes going to have to sort of scramble to find all the materials it needs. And it's also prone to typhoons or hurricanes and earthquakes. So, for a lot of Japan's early history, people were small village and rural farmers, or even hunter gatherers. But as China slowly started to spread its reach, Japan started to develop its own culture. One of Japan's oldest religions is Shinto. Shinto means way of the gods or way of the divine, and it is related to what we consider animistic religions. Animistic religions are ones that worship nature or nature spirits. And in Shinto, people believe that many things in nature have these divine spirits attached to them. Those spirits are called kami. A particular mountain or tree or forest or bay or sea all might be considered to have their own kami. And Shinto is still popular in Japan. Now, we do see Shinto having some influence of Buddhism and Confucianism today, but it is Japan's indigenous religion. During the 400s AD, Japan started to consolidate power in the hands of one of its clans called the Yamato clan. And one of the Yamato leaders eventually declares himself emperor over the rest of Japan. Now, this early on, the Yamato lacked a lot of unity over the entirety of Japan, but their dynasty is going to continue. And in fact, even today, Japan's emperor is a descendant of the Yamato. So it's this long, contiguous dynasty. As time goes on, though, the emperor actually loses power. He starts to become seen as just sort of a figurehead. But it's important to remember that these emperors do have a continuous line. So all the emperors claim descendant from the Shinto sun goddess Amaterasu, which means it's hard for other people to claim to be emperor. But other clans will control the capital or control the Yamato clan, and they will become the real power in Japan. So relatively early on, China has an outsized influence on Japan. If you look at Japanese culture, a lot of parts of Japanese culture come from Japan. There's Buddhism and Confucianism, which led to a development in Japan's religion and culture, as well as the Japanese writing system is a descendant of Chinese. But Japan will develop its own complex culture starting around the 8th century. This golden age for Japan is called the Heian period. Unlike other golden ages we've seen, there's not necessarily a lot of economic prosperity or technological development, but it's really all cultural. There's an emphasis on etiquette and beauty. Everything in the Heian period led around the court, the royal court in Kyoto. There were many aristocrats, princes, emperors, and they developed these really complex sets of rules about what you could wear, who you could talk to, how you should talk, what you should eat, how many swords you could wear. So this very complex set of etiquette. A good example of literature from this period is called the Tale of Genji. It was written by a aristocratic woman named Lady Murasaki, and it's considered one of the oldest novels in history. It's set during the Heian period, but it's about characters that are entirely fictional. And it gives us a good picture of sort of what life was like during the Heian period in the court. Here in these illustrations, you can see male and female courtiers, or people who would have participated in the Japanese court life. And you can see their complex robes, their hairstyles, the makeup on the women. It's all sort of set to follow these particular sets of rules. An important side effect of the obsession with court life in the Heian period was that a lot of the Japanese rulers didn't pay much attention to the countryside, where most farmers were. And what happened is that you started to see all these groups of bandits or other thieves and warriors attacking a lot of farmers. So to protect themselves, farmers are going to start to turn to these large landowners called daimyo. Daimyo weren't necessarily noble, but originally they were just sort of people who owned a lot of land. And they often hired to protect themselves these servants called samurai, or bodyguards. And as the peasants start to have to deal with all these bandits, they turn to the daimyo and ask for help. And they end up selling not necessarily their land itself, but rights to the produce of the land to the daimyo in exchange for protection. So they develop their own feudal system in this way. There's an important distinction there that the daimyo don't actually own the land of the peasants, like we saw in Europe's feudal system. But instead, the peasants sort of sell the property of their land, the production of the food, to the daimyo in exchange for that protection. Now, originally samurai were not nobles, they were just servants. But since they become the military class, over time they do start to gain a lot of political power. Similar to knights, they did follow a code of honor called Bushido. Bushido means the way of the warrior. And it was, again, not unlike medieval chivalry in Europe, a set of rules, and both written and unwritten, about how a samurai should conduct himself in defending his lord, and in fighting, and everything else. Again, it was mostly theoretical. A samurai was just as likely to attack a peasant as he was to protect him. But it was part of the samurai culture in Japan. Another big shift was in the 12th century, as you started to see the rise of these daimyo who had many samurai. The various clans of Japan, led by daimyo, started to fight one another. And the emperor eventually turns to the leader of one clan, the Minamoto clan, and appoints him as shogun. Shogun is a title that meant the general of the emperor's army. And effectively what it means is the shogun, or this military dictator, becomes the head of Japan's government. So originally it was to stop both the fighting between the clans, as well as the threat of what they called barbarians, foreigners like the Mongols. But ultimately the shoguns seize power, and the position of shogun becomes a hereditary position. So while the emperor is technically in charge, in practice it's the shogun who has all the authority. And they end up ruling in a separate city from the emperor, and they create their own sort of dynasty. And so the shoguns become their own authority in Japan. It's not something we really see in, say, European feudalism. And with a shogun in charge, this military leader, that means the samurai as the military class start to gain more power and authority. You can see pictures of samurai right here. Actually, the position of samurai is something that continued in Japan until the early 19th century. Unlike European knights, they were not typically mounted, although they did use horses sometimes. And you see their armor doesn't have that much iron in it. Again, Japan's iron poor, so they're going to rely more on leather, wood, and cloth, and then small plates of iron and steel,
rather than the plate armor you saw European knights have. Their most important weapon was a katana, the sword you see depicted there, although they also used bows, spears, and other various medieval weaponry. One of the important aspects of the code of Bushido is an honorable death. Samurai are expected to die before accept any sort of dishonor. So there's this ritual death called seppuku, which is depicted in the picture on the left, where the samurai would take his dagger and basically disembowel himself. And this is something we have evidence that happened with some regularity in Japan among the samurai. And you also, I don't have a picture here, should note that there were some female samurai. Although Bushido and samurai culture mostly revolved around men, there were some exceptions. One famous female samurai, Tomeo Godzen, for example, fought alongside men and was as respected as other ones. That's more the exception than the rule, but it's definitely worth noting. To the right is a very famous samurai, Miyamoto Musashi, who wrote a book about Bushido called The Book of the Five Rings. He's considered one of Japan's most important historical samurai because of his influence on Bushido culture. So, closing that out, make sure you sort of recognize the differences and similarities between Japanese and European feudalism. Thanks.